Hello, Bubba. You having a good time?
Yeah.
All right. Can have an even better time now. I'm Jim Frenkel. I'm a senior editor at Tor Books, and according to this piece of paper in front of me, I'm here because I've edited 8 of our guest of honor's books. So I'll probably ask Vernor way better questions than if you, than if you write more Hugo-winning novels than anyone else ever, including The Fire Upon the Deep and Rainbow's End. How do you top yourself? I won't ask you that question. I hate seeing people have nervous breakdowns. Is a background for academic computing a drawback for an SF writer? Is the singularity looking closer or further away than when you invented it? After you invented the internet and global warming? And how do you write stories that appeal simultaneously and strongly to readers' heads and hearts and sense of adventure without causing bunions? And could Victory Smith take Shelob? I've always wondered that myself. No, but seriously, I will ask Vernor other questions. And this here is Vernor Vinge, if you didn't already know, our writer guest of honor. We can have a little applause now. So, there's one thing, we've talked before. I mean, Vernor and I have known each other for more than 30 years. I think it goes back to about 1980 when something arrived in the mail called True Names, and he had sent it so that Joan Vinge could look at it and read it, and she was busy writing something for me, and so I opened the envelope and I said, could I read this? And she said, sure. So I did, and I had read your stuff before, but True Names was really a revelation, and I thought it was extremely cool, and I still think it's extremely cool. And we've worked together on, as it says, 8 books. I'll take their word for it, and we've worked together, I think, very, very well. I've been really lucky to work with such a talented writer. But one thing I've never asked you is, what was it that got you interested in science fiction in the first place?
Well, as a child, I was annoyed that when I read stories that the world was always the same at the end of the story as at the beginning of the story. And actually, that was much more common in the 1950s than it is now. And occasionally you'd run into a story that where the world was different in the story, but then it turned out all to be a dream. That was even more annoying than the first category of stories. But I found that there was a correlation between stories that were called science fiction and stories where the world really was different. So that was I think a fundamental point of encouragement. And my parents tell me that the first book that I read all the way through, I was actually quite old. I was in 2nd grade by the time I got to that point, but the first book that I ever read all the way through was Between Planets. And I couldn't get through Black Beauty. I hit page 44 in Black Beauty. This would have been earlier, but it kind of gives some insight into what it's like to be a child trying to read. And I got to page 44 of Black Beauty, and I came across a sentence in which the word had, H-A-D, was immediately followed by the word had. And I said, if these guys won't write sentences that parse, I won't bother to read their stories.
You knew the word parse at the time?
No, apparently I invented the concept on the fly, and I didn't have a word for it. But that was sufficient to stop me reading it. Of course, the fact that the sentence parsed perfectly well, that in English had can follow had, that somehow was beyond my intellectual horizon, which illustrates the interesting thing that you can get children who, I think very commonly, in some areas of where they think and talk, they may actually seem very intelligent, say verbally, but they still can't do things like the water volume comparison test that Piaget puts as a stage.
So So basically, you were attracted to science fiction because you felt it presented. Is this something? Can you hear me? This is, why did this turn off? This was working. No. That's working. Hello. That's better.
Yes.
That's weird.
You have been shut down.
Is this technology or magic? The answer is yes. Anyway, so in other words, it sounds like you were not happy with the way the world was, or were you just intrigued more by the notion of the world, a story in which the world changed?
I'm speculating now, but I suspect that I thought the world could be better, which doesn't necessarily mean that I thought that it was bad. But where's the action?
Right. Well, it sounds like you had a normal childhood.
Oh yeah.
I don't know anybody who's grown up, which is most people I know, who doesn't have qualms about the way the world is when they're kids. Grown-ups get to do much cooler stuff, don't they? Did you think that grown-ups got to do cooler stuff?
No, actually, I think I may have had some relatively strange ideas. I really thought that...
You cherish those ideas.
I really did not look forward to growing up.
Yeah.
And my mother assured me that actually the problems that I thought that adults faced actually didn't look as big to the adults as the
I haven't even brought up the singularity yet. Wow.
So I thought that she claimed that the problems that adults face are not as serious to the adults as the problems that children face are to the children, which may or may not be true, but I wasn't sure I believed it. I also was not helped. This is really an anecdote that fits, although it's probably not a big deal. I was not helped by listening to the radio news about the Korean War. And at one point, the announcer said that they were about to draft 8-year-olds.
Really?
Yes, and I think I was 7 years old at the time. And she assured me, my mother assured me, that this was a misspoken, that the guy was probably talking about, she was sure the guy was talking about 18-year-olds. And I said, well, that's all very well, but someday I'll probably be 18 years old. And she said, well, by that time there may not be war anymore, Vernor.
That's a nice thought. Okay, so speaking of the lights going out and back on again, I wanted to talk a little bit about the singularity. You are credited with really being the first person to define the singularity, to write about it coherently, and a lot of people think of you as kind of the father of the singularity, which is probably a strange thing to think of. How can one father a singularity? It must be really painful. But is there something in particular that made you, that gave you the idea for the singularity in the first place? Some incident or something that happened to you, or some circumstance?
First of all, I'm certainly not the first person to think of the idea that superhuman intelligence via technology can arise in the relatively near future. So, although that idea, I think, is new in the 20th century, Butler in the late 19th century, I think, may have had the idea too. So I'll push it back to Butler. But I think the idea of superhuman intelligence via technology in the relatively near future, that is, at least in the last 2 centuries, a new idea. I think that using the term singularity for that particular event, the rise of superhuman intelligence, I may have been the first person to use the term singularity for that event in that way. And it came up actually it arose the general idea, of course, came to me just from reading science fiction, where science fiction writers looked at computers, and the idea that they could become superhumanly intelligent was there, and I knew enough about what was going on with AI in the late 50s. Marvin Minsky and McCarthy, had their meetings where they were talking about this. So I knew about this, and actually most of my stories are about this. And even if you look at the first story that I wrote that ever sold was Bookworm Run, and the last paragraph of that is really kind of a recapitulation of the idea of why the singularity would be an especially different sort of superhuman intelligence would be a different sort of technological progress than past progress. Then, after I wrote True Names, Marvin Minsky invited me to various places. I think the first one may have been an AI conference at Carnegie Mellon. And so I was on this panel with Jim Hogan and Bob Sheckley and Marvin Minsky and myself. I think that may have been the entire panel. It was a very fun panel. And I was blathering along, and I had been exposed to all of these people, and those people really have this idea about technological progress and the significance of superhuman intelligence. But it just occurred to me that as on the panel, as I'm listening to the panel and I'm thinking of what to write, that the term singularity actually was an excellent metaphor for what superhuman intelligence would be like. That it's a metaphor both broadly with the meaning of singularity in mathematics, but also more in a more focused way, the analogy with black hole singularities in relativity. This unknowability issue, which has always loomed very large in the way I look at this, fit with the unknowability, or at least the lack of information that you have about what goes on inside a black hole. There's only a few things we can know about what's going on inside the black hole. So as a metaphor, I thought it was a really cool metaphor. And during the panel, this was in 1982, during the panel, I brought this up. And two things happened immediately after the panel. One is, the earliest time that anybody came up to me and said, I think this already happened, with the rise of nations. And I think that's still a good response, that the rise of the state actually, I'm not a big fan of using the anthropomorphication of state and state power and the king as a higher level person, but there is still something about that's an early form of collaboration. So that was one thing that happened. The other thing that happened was that an editor named, I don't remember his first name, Lyle, from Omni. He was out at Omni? Oh, okay, then that must be it. Anyway, he came up and said, say, would you like to write this up as an op-ed in Omni? So actually, that was the first time I ever wrote about the singularity, and that op-ed is also from 1982 or 1983. Then I had 10 years to fool around with this. When I go to conventions and stuff, I would talk about the singularity, and I got all sorts of feedback. And it was like I got to think about the idea for 10 years, and it was not common coinage, or at least not the use of that term. And I wrote a couple novels where I used the idea, in particular, Marooned in Real Time, the idea of the technological singularity is sort of central to that story. And then in 1992, Jeff Landis, I think, was probably responsible for this invitation. I got invited to talk at a NASA conference at what was then the Glenn Research Center in Cleveland. And I decided to write about the singularity. And so I'd had 10 years of talking to folks like you about the idea and getting the feedback, especially from programmers.
Computer programmers.
Yes, computer programmers. And it really the the essay that I wrote for that meeting, which is the one that is the one you'll find if you do a URL lookup, the coming technological singularity. I really like that essay. It's 1992, and sometimes people ask me if there's anything I would change. Well, the terminology is certainly creaky if you read that essay, but there's very little that I would change, and really nothing that I would contradict. And one reason it covers the bases and does a really nice job is that it was basically 10 years worth of thinking about the idea, and not only my thinking about the idea, but getting feedback about the idea. That was all just sort of hidden because the internet was not there for me to blog upon.
Which you do a lot of now.
Oh yeah, I blog all the time. Right.
You've seen Vernor's blog, I'm sure. Oh, that's right, you don't blog.
Right, I don't blog.
You may be the only person in this room who doesn't blog. But that's okay.
And actually, I'm just astounded at how good blogs are. I mean, obviously, I can't mean every blog that's ever been written, but if I had to write something every day for publication, it would be a moving disaster zone. And so I am very much impressed, and I think overall, blogging and the civilizational conversation that's going on the net is a very powerful and wonderful thing.
I mean, as you were talking about the 10 years, I was thinking, well, you had your own little mini singularity going there. This collaborative effort where you're brainstorming the thing. But did it ever bother you that? I mean, did you ever think about not calling it the singularity because of the fact that it was already something identified with black holes so strongly?
Oh, no, just the opposite. In other words, it's an evocative...
So you hate astronomers?
Wait, I didn't understand what you said.
Well, I mean, the singularity is a term applied to black holes. And
okay.
Here you are co-opting their term.
That's a little bit like saying some poet who talks about fire is co-opting the people who invented fire, or the people...
And it's true. Damn those poets.
Right.
So, do you still think it's going to happen when you originally thought it was going to happen?
The 92 essay, I think since I'd had 10 years to think about this, I was very good at weasel-worded, and the way I think the way I first wrote it was a disaster, and Charles Platt pointed out to me that you don't want to say it's going to happen in 30 years. That's what they all say. That they've been saying it. Even in 1992, they've been saying that for 30 years. Don't say it. If you're that is too weasel worded, And so I actually, in the first paragraph, I say I would be surprised if it happened before 2005, and I'd be surprised if it hadn't happened by 2030. And I'm not sure whether I said the following, but which I should have said, and that is that it's not a point of faith with me that it's going to happen. I think that if it's physically possible, technologically possible, it will happen. But it could be stopped. There are ways of stopping it.
What do you think of the most likely things that could stop it?
Oh, if the human race died.
Entirely?
Yeah.
Do you think that?
In fact, we're kind of those machines really need us, at least to start with.
I hope you're right. Do you think it's likely that the human race will die out before we can get to the singularity?
No.
So?
However, we do have the competence to do that.
The competence to eliminate ourselves.
Right.
That's unfortunate.
And in fact, in a way, I recently did a very short essay for these edge questions that come out in the latest edge question that Brockman put out was, what do you worry about? And I think that we validly worry about terrorism. We validly, since John Brunner anyway, have understood that technology there are really nuts out there And if the technology cheaply existed to do extraordinarily destructive things, there are crazy people out there who would love to do those crazy things. So there's sort of a race between technology, destructive technology, and the nutcases. And this can look very discouraging, and after 9/11 and after the possibilities of extreme nuclear proliferation, it's even scarier. But there's something scarier than that, and that is if you look at what we were engaged in the 20th century and what we could fall back into in this century, and that is when large nations composed of millions of good people decide to get into a strategic defense posture that involves mutually assured destruction policies. In that case, you have the best and the brightest by the millions with all the wealth that their nations have conspiring to create a non-survivable disaster. And that makes the terrorism, depending on what's actually technology hands us, that could be an existential threat. MAD is an existential threat. So I think that's possible, but I'm not trotting that out to really be frightening. I'm just saying that is something that's possible, and it's also something that probably to think about ways that we can avoid falling back into the situation we were in the 20th century. Now, there are some people who say, but we got through the 20th century. MAD was good. MAD was such a terrible thing that it prevented the use of the weapons. And actually, that's true. I mean, there were situations where very mean-spirited people backed off. But then you go back and look at World War I, and you realize it's not a sure thing. And we only have the one test case here. And I prefer not to jiggle it too hard.
I think it's comforting that mutually assured destruction has that acronym MAD. So
yes, we have to thank whoever was in charge of the acronym factory.
Well, I mean, I think it's good because, I mean, the idea of something being mad as in insane, it's maybe a good reminder to us that, technology is better when used for good than for evil. Of course, evil is a relative term. I mean, this is from the editor who fostered the book, The Mad Scientist's Guide to World Domination. That's me.
But you don't have a copy. Oh, you do.
I do have a copy here. I'll show it to you when I get a chance. But anyway, I want to ask you other things. I'm sure they want to hear other things from you. But you do think that it's likely to actually happen, though.
The singularity.
The singularity.
Oh yeah, I think the singularity is more likely than the
end of the world.
In fact, I think the singularity is the most likely non-catastrophic event of the next 20 years.
So we have 17 years. I'm counting. Well, I know.
In fact, I think that the teen years are going to be very interesting. I think
the teen years always are very interesting.
Yes, that's freighted with various.
Yes, you've met my daughter.
Yes.
She was a teenager.
I think the teen years will be very interesting. We're entering a period of time which was really one of the concrete reference points of people like Hans Morbek, who I respect enormously, and that is that checkpoint is the estimates that various people did for what the computational power of the human brain is, the raw computational power. Leave aside the obviously deep and important issues of how it's organized, and also leaving aside the fact that good arguments could be made for the hardware estimates being woefully inadequately weak. But
you say inadequately.
I mean, if you think that a neuron has the power of a simple microprocessor of the 1980s, then actually the era we're entering now is one where we have competitive power available in the largest machines. And that means that for the first time, there is some sort of outside objective evidence of outside of mad herring along trend line extrapolations for expecting something cool to come out of it. On the other hand, I've been at meetings where this was actually one of the startup questions. What is the computational power of the raw computational power of the brain? And I was at
Of the brain.
human brain, and this was like '92 or '93, and I was very again, I think it was probably Marvin Minsky that put me into this conference. And I'm listening to these guys, and some of them were neuro people, and some of them were pure computer people. One of the pure computer people figured that the most powerful, that the human brain wasn't more than a few orders of magnitude more powerful than the biggest computer that he could make. And then there was the general consensus, which was what I was saying about how the era we're in now, petaflop to exaflop, was the right measure. Although I'd have to do I'm not sure if I can make that claim sitting here right now. And then there was some of the neuro people who were saying one neuron, they figured, was as computational powerful as the largest computer that anybody had ever made. Now, if those guys were right, you have to slide a lot further along the trend curves before you, even in terms of hardware, expect something interesting to happen. So the teams are going to be fun, and there are serious projects that are underway that I think would give us some very intriguing surprises. In fact, philosophically, I would imagine that by in the teen years, we are actually going to have the goalposts of what it is to be a person are going to undergo a further slide, and even if we don't have the singularity, there is going to be some serious question about what's going on with the stuff that we are using, and being able to do almost any white-collar job automatically is certainly a serious a serious comment upon the human future.
So, okay, so you talk about projects going on. Do people approach you about becoming part of the singularity?
No.
Not yet. Do you? I mean,
because for one thing, I mean, I don't claim to be running any research programs. I'm just.
You don't claim to.
And I'm not.
That's a really intriguing one. Okay, and he's not. You know, Dr. Evil out there, he said he's not. And do you think that you might become part of a singularity? Or is it, you think there's going to be one singularity, or can there be many singularities?
Well, I think there are a number, if one looks at all the different ways that technology could make superhuman intelligence, I think there's a number of fundamentally different ways that it could happen, and it can be attained. And in fact, that's one reason for giving me confidence that this thing is on the way. And those different trajectories towards superhuman intelligence are sufficiently different that I think they would give rise to very different sorts of minds. I gave a talk at an AI conference a couple of years ago, and the title of the talk was Species of Mind. And the notion is actually, in significant part, it's inspired by Carl Schrader's books. He's done and I think most of his stuff is from Tor.
Yes.
And he's done some very nice stories that illustrate the issues of different styles of mind. And I got a couple examples, but I remember one of his plot lines was the characters realizing rather late in the story that they had been oriented toward one enemy because that enemy had a style of mind that was just totally different from humans or mammals. And for one thing, it didn't regard death quite the same way, and which meant that it was going around killing people occasionally. You know, it didn't need whatever they were dealing with didn't need too much of an excuse to kill people. But they realized that was part of just the way that it was built, and actually the alien and apparently inimical minds eventually figures out enough what's going on is actually they get word through, you know, it's very indirect and hard to see, but that really the humans in the story have a lot more to fear from some other artificial minds that are very humanoid or reptilian. I mean, it's all one camp, really, on this scale. And that it might behoove us to make allies with these people that had been so strange. I think one example of something that is fairly strange, and which is also one of the paths I see, is to imagine what it would be like if most of reality had embedded network microprocessors associated with it on various scales. In that case, individual objects like this microphone or this plastic cup would not probably be anywhere near as smart as we are. But the thing is, they're embedded in a fabric of things that are equally smart, and it begins to look like animism, where there's a spirit of the place, and sort of for this reason, one term I use for this scheme is digital Gaia. That the ensemble would be something that would have an intellectual power, but it would be very different from what we imagine when we talk about superhuman intelligence, which often very much just looks like certain famous Western religions.
Like when you say certain famous Western religions, like what?
The big three.
The big three. Okay. Well, we won't go further with that because it's not supposed to be really about religion. So when I first read Maroon in Real Time and realized that you were talking about the singularity, I thought, well, that could be really cool or really horrible, depending on which side you're on, and what it really means. And then you wrote a book called The Fire Upon the Deep after Maroon in Real Time.
Yeah.
Well, when I say it depends on which side of it you're on, what does the singularity? I mean, in Maroon in Real Time, there are 300 people left on the world, and so you wonder when you finish with that book, you wonder what really happened. Where did everybody go and why?
Right.
And there's the singularity in the middle, in the history of the world before then, and you think, well, that's interesting. Is that good or bad? And it depends on whether you're alive or dead, I think. But then you wrote your next novel 7 years later. There was a series of novels 7 years apart.
He laughs because, as he pointed out to me once, he said, Vernor, your last book, it was really popular. There's fans out there that really want your next book, and then he comes around later and but the problem is it takes so long between your books, Vernor, that your fans, they're all dead.
I don't remember saying it that way. I think I may have been exaggerating, but well, I know not all of them are dead because I'm a fan. But when you wrote A Fire Upon the Deep, you created something called the Zones of Thought.
Yeah.
And I remember asking you at the time, why you invented the zones of thought, and you told me why at the time, but I don't know that you've said it publicly. Would you like to maybe tell people why you invented the zones of thought?
Well, there are plenty of people, for various reasons, many of them very good reasons, who have no interest in the singularity and for whom the singularity holds no credibility. On the other hand, a lot of the people who buy science fiction actually regard the singularity as at least as likely as I do. That is a very reasonable extrapolation of technological trends. And I like to write hard science fiction. Well, I like to say that science fiction writers were the first occupational group that were impacted by the singularity, whether or not it happens. Because if we're trying to write books that sell, there's going to be people out there, if we write a space adventure, say, who are going to say, well, where's the singularity? This story is not credible as hard science fiction because, the singularity would have happened long before the events in this story happened. And I think that this has had an impact on writers of science fiction in general, not necessarily because of anything that I've said or written, but just because as we get closer, as technology and automation improves, and we get closer, whatever you want to call this event, it is part of the zeitgeist, and so it's a problem that all science fiction writers face. And so, the inspiration definitely does not have to come from any particular person, but a solution for it has to be invented by a lot of different writers. And if you look at your favorite writers of space opera, say, since the year 2000, it is incumbent upon them to have something in the story that sort of says to all those closet believers in the singularity, why the whole situation is not dominated by superhuman intelligences. So one can face it fairly squarely on and just say, well, we're pets, and I'm going to tell you a story about the pets. And the superminds will stay off to the side. That's one approach. You can do what I did in Marooned in Real Time, and you have a really big war that doesn't quite kill us all, but it slows things down for a long time, and then you can do anything you want. You can have swords along with airplanes and stuff like that. And what I did in the Zones of Thought was I made a magical assumption that the singularity can't happen in certain parts of the universe, namely where we are. So our part of the universe...
That's very convenient.
Yeah, very convenient. I call that the slow zone, and all our worst and most conservative scientific prejudices are true here. Speed of light is the fastest speed. I decided to just throw that in because that's kind of another thing that bars us from having completely wild-eyed stories. The speed of light is the maximum speed, and superhuman intelligence is not possible here. And then, after we've been out in space for a long time, we eventually go into if we go far enough out into the galaxy that we find places where the rules change. And so I call those the zones of thought. And it's much more...
That area out there is called the transcend.
Well, actually, the area into us is called the unthinking depths. That's where human-level intelligence is not possible. You don't want to go in that direction. And the area next out is one where superhuman intelligence is still not possible, but faster-than-light travel is. So that was sort of a gratuitous piece of magic I didn't have to do, but it made things more fun for me. So the result is sort of a Rube Goldberg construction, where you have the transcend, where all this stuff that the wild-eyed science fiction people always wanted as possible, and then the beyond, where faster-than-light travel is possible. And we're in the unthinking depths. We're in the slow zone. And although it was in a Rube Goldberg way, it gave me something that Larry Niven got in a much more concrete way. And that is, if you look at his known space stories, as time goes by, the humans come across higher levels of technology. So I think he eventually has things like faster-than-light drive. And in the early stories, or at least the chronologically earlier stories, we start out with slower-than-light stuff, and so he's able to write stories about that. In the zones of thought, I can sort of skip all the intermediate and do whatever good parts I want, and in the Fire Upon the Deep, actually, indirectly, all of those four zones are not all visited, but two of the zones are visited, and the other two zones have significant impact on the story.
They're all involved in one way or another.
Right.
Yeah. So now you've written, well, as far as we know, at least 3 novels that take place in your zones of thought, and maybe more, depending on how you look at things. But you and I have been talking about what you're going to write next.
Yes.
And I've been sent by Master Control to find out what you are going to write next and when you're going to start.
Known as Cousin Guido at...
Cousin Guido, that's true. He no longer works for the Vatican. You find the Pope in the pizza and you win a prize. So we've talked about what you might do next, and because you've had basically what I think of as singularities, that one of which is called the Blight. That appears in, well, it doesn't literally appear, but the effects of it appear in Fire Upon the Deep, and weird stuff that's connected to the zones of thought happens thousands of years before in Deepness in the Sky, and in Children of the Sky, it's about 10 years after most of the book, after Fire Upon the Deep. But you have another Zones of Thought book that we're talking about, don't you? Would you tell us something about this for a minute?
Oh, sure. Actually,
he's such a tough guy.
I am closing in on trying to decide what to write next, and I have two general areas that I can do a story in, and I've actually chatted them up with Jim and thought about them a lot. And one of them is relative, is sort of like a sequel to Rainbow's End, so it's not Zones of Thought. I think as Charlie Strauss pointed out here on a panel earlier today, sequels to near future stuff, to near future science fiction, are really a problem, because if you're talking about near future, you're talking about really short-term extrapolations, and so if you have even if you write are as prolific as Charlie, that's a problem. If you're as prolific as I am, where there's like 10 years between Rainbow's End came out in 2006, and even at the most optimistic, a Rainbow's End sequel, would be mid-teens, and to have it be about the same characters but extrapolated a few more years in the future, it'd be very hard to maintain story continuity. So I call it RE2, but it might not really be a strict sequel, but it would. I think I can finally write something that's in the early stages of the singularity. So that's one pile of ideas for one possible novel. The other possible novel is in the Zones of Thought, and it would take place about 10 years after the Children of the Sky, between 1 and 10 years after the end of the Children of the Sky. But it takes place in an entirely different place. And for those of you who have, at least recently or with good memory, have read Fire Upon the Deep, you will recall that there was a human fleet called the Aniara fleet that really saved the bacon for our hero and heroine as they were trying to escape to the Tynes world. And then the Zone Surge came, and the Aniara fleet hightailed it to some, they didn't really know where they were going to go, hence the name Aniara Fleet. The guy who insisted on helping the hero in Fire Upon the Deep, he sort of was the commander of that fleet, and he made the command decision to do that. Well, this story would be about where they are, where they ended up, and the butterflies and jackboots, if you remember that group of characters.
One of my favorite images.
Right. Otherwise known as Death to Vermin. The Death to Vermin group, which had killed most of the humans in the Beyond.
Yes, we're the vermin.
Right, yeah, we're the vermin. And they also had hightailed it. So these guys have all ended up like refugees from some genocidal conflict. Refugees in the U.S., that have come here from someplace else, and they've had this terrible relationship among themselves. That's what the humans and the butterflies are like at wherever they've ended up. And into this mix is the notion that the Zone Surge actually has tumbled things around quite a bit, so that actually there's much more fluid interaction between powers and normal intelligences.
Right. When you say powers, you mean
superhuman intelligences.
Right.
So this situation is one where it's kind of everything that the characters in Children of the Sky and Fire Upon the Deep, everything they were speculating about, no, not everything, but much of what they were speculating about the outside is actually revealed. And the outside is intensely interested in what's going on in Tynes' world, and is interested in mounting a project to get down there. If you read Children of the Sky, you know that there's some real problems with apparent zone instability near the Tynes world. For the people in the Aniara fleet, actually, it's much worse. And there's reasons for that. But I think actually there's the setup for this rescue expedition and doing something that I probably should have done a long time ago, and that is there are characters that should have realized that the Tynes world must be special. It must be a setup on the part of whoever was writing the plot.
Who shall remain unnamed.
Right, the power that was writing the plot. So I think that's clearly a story, and Jim has been after me to do that one instead of RE2, and we will see what happens.
Well, can I tell them why I was after you?
Oh, yes.
Yeah, my logic was that writing about something like the singularity happening, which is a lot, pretty much where RE2 is, Rainbow's End 2, that's really hard. I mean, people have tried to write about the creation or existence of superhuman intelligences for a long time, and it's really, really hard to do. Whereas in the novel, the Aniara fleet novel that he's talking about, the blight, superhuman intelligences exist as influences in this universe, in the galaxy, and we can see the effects of their actions, of their power and their actions on human and other alien species, and I thought that it would be helpful to him in his quest to write that sequel to Rainbow's End, to write this other book first, because it would enable him to learn more about how these superhuman, these singularities might function.
Right, especially if by the time I finally get around to it, the singularity will have happened.
By which time there won't be any publishing companies anymore, no science fiction conventions.
Actually, I do have a word about that. If you're a superhuman intelligence, it's really a cool time, because can you imagine what it must have been like to be the first human to ever tell a joke? Or the first human to ever write a release book procedural? It could be really bad. But if you're the first guy to ever do it, your name will go down in the history of your race. And so early post-human art is going to be really kind of a cool thing, because these guys are going to be able to do, for the first time in thousands of years, they're going to actually be able to do something new.
That's true. Of course, there are the poor Krell, which I've longed to see return someday. I had one more question for you, and we're running out of time. But I was wondering if you have any particular. This is kind of a standard question, but I've always wondered favorite science fiction story that somebody, or story or novel that somebody else has written.
That's really hard to answer. Partly because Partly because I have all these friends that I'm unwilling to rank. And then
we're only asking for one.
Yeah, I know, but that automatically does rank it. All the people I don't name. There are an extraordinary lot of really good hard science fiction stories that are being written this year. Several of the people who are doing them are here, like Charlie and
Strauss.
Yes, and Ian. Excuse me, right. And Ian Banks, and much of the Edinburgh crew, and then Carl Schrader, and in fact, the thing is, the golden days when there was just one or two people writing about these things, it was so neat, because you could get away with writing about this stuff, and you do your best, and even if no matter what, it still didn't have that much else around it. There's really good stuff that's been written about these issues, and I find that as a writer, I find that intimidating. I think I do actually have a long list of ideas that have not been have not been exploited. I think I really do have the ideas, but it's a much more competitive. Maybe not monetarily, but it's a much more competitive field or subgenre of science fiction than ever.
You have to watch out for the Mac Mafia.
Who's the Mac Mafia?
Those Scots.
What?
All those people in Scotland.
Oh, yes.
So are you going to tell us something that you're particularly fond of?
Oh, no. However, I said enough names there that I was, and David Brin, who just, came out with, I think, the definitive article, fiction or nonfiction, in his book Existence, about the whole issue of interstellar artifacts. That is the most thorough discussion of that I have ever seen. So it's not just these newer writers. I'm just not willing to say there's one that just is.
So you include old writers like David Brin.
Yeah, I was only 10 or 15 years younger than that.
Right. And do you have a particular story or novel of your own that you think of as your favorite?
I used to think Maroon Real Time, and now I think the best written and the most imaginative is A Deepness in the Sky.
Did you hear that? A Deepness in the Sky? It's available in ebook. Well, we are basically out of time, so I'd like to thank you very much for sharing your
It's nice to be up the stone wall. No, I can answer.